So I'm gonna start the record. Okay, so for those on the recording, uh, this is my presentation. These are some general trends, and I'll upload these if anybody wants them. And I'm just talking about my background. So so I realized that there could be a space between spaces of identity, that I didn't have to choose to fit into the box or the square as a Korean Asian person because that didn't fit for me, and I could never fit into the box of being just a white person because racially I could never fit in that box. Um, and so those ideas seeded what became an organization that I started 2 years after college when I was 24. So if there's any undergraduates, this was not something that I ever thought was going to be in my life to start a nonprofit, but I finished, my undergrad studies and was like, I thought I was going to be a doctor. I wanted to help people, but then I realized I didn't really like blood, so maybe not. So I finished college and I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to do. And so I ended up working at a publishing house, John Wiley and Sons, which makes lots of your textbooks, and then ended up, having life experiences and meeting people. So I had this opportunity and was invited to participate in this leadership program offered by Landmark Education, Self-Expression and Leadership. And what the program said was, look at your community and develop a project in it. And so it had me go back to all of this research that I had done as an undergraduate and this kind of aha moment. And I said, I think it would have been really useful for me growing up if I had had role models or mentors of people who had families like mine. So this is now 1996. Many, many, many children are being adopted from China. I'm in New York City. There is a parent group called Families with Children from China. And I say, I want to be their mentors. And so this is again 1996. The internet, if you were on the internet, it was through AOL. You had to go through these things. And so I said, I'm going to start a mentorship program. And what I wanted to create, so in wanting to start a mentorship program, I ended up starting an organization because I had to find mentees and I had to find mentors. And I was really clear, though, that I wanted this to be a space that was not just for adopted Koreans. So it's not Adopted Koreans Association, but it was a space in which adopted people could explore and claim their multiple identities. So I'm Hollee McGinnis, but I'm also known as Ihwa Young, and that is my Korean birth name. So that idea that we could also be known so much more than what we might show up as was really at the heart of the organization. And then to really help adoptees feel empowered in the fact that their life does not fit into a box, none of the social boxes out there. And then the other part was thinking, well, okay, now that not everyone gets to be adopted internationally, and it was kind of this flip or reframing of, why is my life so complicated? Why couldn't I just look like my parents, have a name that kind of fits my race, all those kinds of simplicity, and just reframing it, say, okay, if everyone doesn't get to have this, what can I teach the world? And one idea that I had at the time was that we could build bridges, between our birth cultures and our adoptive cultures, between multiple groups of people, because our lives crossed all of these forms of difference. And then the big dream was to transform conceptions around race, because I realized that I always knew who I was, but other people didn't, because they had certain conceptions when they saw me of who and what I was expected to do and behave. And I saw that the only way I could be me is if we transform the way we saw each other through our racialized lenses. So also known as is still going strong. It's actually, this year is its 25th anniversary. Adoptees kept stepping into the spaces. Some of the board members now, we've had board members who were adopted from Colombia, and then they started their own group. From the Philippines, they started their own group. And now we have Chinese adoptees who were former mentees, now taking leadership roles. So it's really quite a dynamic organization. But also known as wasn't the first group that had started. So there was actually Korean adoptee associations that had started earlier than also known as in Europe. And so what we kind of see is that in this late 1980s, when that first generation, that war generation, began entering into adulthood, they started to say, these are things that were important to me or would have been important to me. So Hollee International started motherland tours starting in 1973. Culture camps began to get developed, and then some adoptees became leaders within adoption agencies as well. So I'm going to share some research that I had done when I worked at the Donaldson Adoption Institute. We did a national study looking at adoption identity and racial identity, because conceptually they're intertwined, but conceptually they're distinct as well. And then this qualitative interviews that I had done on some of these Korean adoptee leaders in the US who started different organizations. It's never too late. You can still know about this. One person said, I wish I had known about this back then. And then what group did the people adopted from Colombia started? They ended up being more of, I don't have the name right now, and I don't know if they're still active, but the Colombian adoptee, I can find out if the group is still active at all. Okay, so why? One of the core questions for Asian transracial adoptees has been around identity. So what happened is that you know, in the early 1970s, there was a lot of Black-white transracial adoption of Black children into white families. But the African American community, and particularly the Association for Black Social Workers, really argued against the practice as a form of genocide, as a form of, you know, that it would not prepare those children to live in racialized experiences and lives. And so then a lot of research started to get kind of looked at to see, well, like, do the Black children, you know, are they well adjusted? But the international transracial adoption never reached that level of critique in the 70s. So that's why the vast majority of transracial adoptions in the US are of international transracial adoptees who are Asian. And what this body of research basically found was that, yes, in terms of general adjustment, transracial adoptees of all races do well compared to children who remain in either abusive, neglectful families, or in foster care, or in institutionalized care. But the research also shows that that their white adopted parents are not comfortable preparing their minoritized, racialized children for racial bias. They're comfortable with culture and their culture and with pride, but there is more work to be done in terms of really talking about race and racism. So that was what really the body of research showed. And so this quote, I think, indicates why identity is so important for transracial, international, Asian adoptees raised predominantly in white families, because it's very complicated for us. So in this, one respondent said, I think there was a time when it frustrated and angered me that people were mean because I was a different race from my parents. This is a Korean adoptee in a white home. I'm not sure that I wanted to be their race as much as I wanted to have control over whether to disclose that I was adopted or not. It was also difficult, especially in adolescence, when fitting in is so important that I did not look like the standard of beauty in magazines and on television. White, blonde, blue-eyed. As I grew older and more secure with who I am, and as media has increasingly included people that look like me, I no longer felt a desire to be white. So, you know, one of the concerns then, you know, there's so much richness in just this one little paragraph that we could try to, you know, pull apart. But I'd like to think of the complexity of identity as these kind of layers of a cake. So at the base of the cake, right, is this foundational general human identity development. We're all asking, you know, who am I? And the question of who am I first gets answered when we're wee little babies in our interaction with the grownups in our life. This is attachment theory, right? And so children begin to get a sense of I am an I, this is a you, and in those interactions get working models about how the world is and how it looks. And then what we know is that by adolescence, people are beginning to have the cognitive ability to develop their own identities that are separate from their parents. And so that work gets extra complicated for adopted people because the adoption identity piece really is a question of how do I belong to one family, and how come I lost another family? So the paradox that adoption identity enters into is this paradox of I loved you, so I gave you away. This is the core question that adoptees, adoptive parents have to find some sort of resolution to. That I loved you, so I gave you away. And then with the racial identity identity development for white for adoptees is complicated because we don't grow up in the spaces, in the day-to-day moments as other people who are raised in families that have the same race as them. When I was a senior in college, I did a small study just interviewing 7 or 8 other Korean adopted women who were in college, myself. But I did a lot of reading around white ethnic identity by the sociologist Mary Waters. And she was describing how white people do their ethnicity, which is, so if you're Italian American, you go to Little Italy, you eat some food, you cook. If you're Irish, you do something really big on St. Patty's Day. And I realized that for me, my racial identity, that's kind of how I do Korean. I go to a Korean restaurant, it's like Lunar New Year, I get all fessed up. But when you are of that racial group, like African Americans or even my Asian American friends, there's a day-to-day-ness of their racial identity too that is being incorporated, that as a transracial adoptee, I have no idea. I haven't lived that way. I haven't thought that way or breathed that way. And so that's that racial identity piece, that paradox of being raised as white but not being physically white. Rich Lee has described that as the transracial adoption paradox. And then another piece that I like to include is the transnational adoption identity. And to me, that is not only am I part of a biological family and an adoptive family. Not am I only part of a racial group and another racial group, but I'm also part of another nation and history, and then experience of cross colonization, imperialism. And so all of that also then has to be integrated to understand fully what was the context in South Korea that goes beyond just choices of my biological parents, right? Because we in America, in the West, we look at individuals and we individualize problems. But the truth of the matter is that every individual is in a context, right? So to understand that context that individual is making those decisions in, you have to understand culture, you have to understand history, you have to understand all those other things. And so for the transnational adoptee, we then also have to understand this at this kind of even more macro level. So that's why identity is really complicated. And so I'll just share a couple of leadership. So Susan Cox is a vice president currently even at Holt International. And she said she was, I think, like Holt was like the 16th child that the Holt agency brought to the US after the Korean War. So she's mixed race. I felt like I was the only adoptee for years. I felt like an island. I did a lot of explaining. I felt like policies and laws at the time of adoption didn't take into account what happened years later. And I think that's a sentiment that continues for many adult adoptees now who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and have decided to kind of make their career of changing some of these policies. Um, and another person, so Sandy McLaughlin, she started the first culture camps through Holt. She said, I hated rice and I didn't know how to use chopsticks. What does it really mean to be Korean? Camp was an opportunity to be around other adopted kids and to learn about Korean culture. Um, and I grew up not having really any experience with these kinds of camps. And so for me, with also known as, um, when the young people that we were mentoring, who grew up having the mentorship program, said this was really valuable to me. I want to become a mentor. That to me was the evidence that we were doing something right. I had crafted this idea out of what I did not have, but I didn't know if it actually worked. It was the adoptees who attended these camps and then became counselors. And I asked them, why do you come? And why is this so important? Um, that was the evidence that they were doing something right. Many of them would say, similar to Sandy here, was that was like 2 or 3 days out of the year that they didn't have to explain anything about who they were. They could just be. In many ways, also known as became that, because I had to find adoptees and then attract them and then to become mentors. And then I realized some adoptees don't want to become mentors; they just want to hang out. So then we started to do things to hang out and socialize in New York City. But then I said, well, but there's things for us to learn. So then we started to do workshops, and and so that's how the organization, became much more organic, because it was kind of just observing what people were kind of needing and seeing like, hey, could we do that for each other? But the empowerment part of it was that it was being all driven by us. There was no adoptive parent telling us what to do. There was no adoption agency person telling us what to do. We were listening to each other and saying, how can we help one another? And that is what I consider true empowerment. So in the Beyond Culture Camp study that we did, we asked the adult adoptees, and we had a sample of Korean transracial adoptees in white families, and then white same race adoptees in white families. When was their adoption identity important to them? And I think what's really important in this slide, I hope you can, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but is that for the vast majority, when they were, preschool and elementary, it was not important to them. But you see some difference between the Korean line, which is the blue, and the white adoptee line. But I think what's also really important is that in preschool, 15 to 25% said that it was important to them. And so that's why we see such variability. Sometimes little children are really already thinking about this stuff. And then there's other adoptees that are like, I haven't thought about any of this until they hit 40. And so and again, what we see is that by middle and by high school, and certainly by college, the vast majority of both white adoptees and Korean adoptees are starting to think about the importance of their adoptive identity. Now, how it was important, we didn't define any of that, but that was just a simple way of us to kind of capture that the salience of their adoption and the meaning about their adoption began to really come more to the forefront, and it became more to the forefront in emerging adulthood. And then what's really striking is that it continues. You would think like, okay, well, maybe we're done, right? Now, part of this is as a result of our sample size. We didn't have a lot of people in a late adulthood, but I think it's still intriguing that by young adulthood and middle adulthood, the vast majority of adoptees are thinking about this stuff. So what that leads me to say is that, when we're young, and if you're an adoptive parent or a cousin of an adoptive parent, we need to start talking about this stuff. And I'm always wanting to shift the age, right? So if we can start these conversations here, it's clearly not going to mean that we're going to be done. But the earlier we can begin to say, it's okay to ask these questions. It's okay to say, I don't fit in. It's okay to begin creating your own narrative, because you're going to continue that work anyway. And what we've found in a lot of the adoption literature is that because of a sense of loyalty to adoptive parents, adoptees will not engage in behavior that could help them understand more. And another part of adoptive identity, is that paradox, but it's also all the information we don't have. And it's not around the adoption, but it's around the surrender. And so efforts among white adoptees, especially for getting access to birth records, it is not a critique of adoption. It is more a question about what did I surrender and what information, that I should have a right to, that actually could affect my medical health and my children's medical health. But because of the way we practice closed adoption, adoptees don't have access to. And so that, I think, becomes a lot of what is being worked on into adulthood. And I'm actually conducting a study looking at adult outcomes and how adoptees are doing in their later adulthood, because we don't really know. And then what we see is that racial ethnic identity also has different varying levels of salience or importance, as the adoptees reported. And not surprisingly, for the Korean adoptees, which again is the blue line, and the white same race adoptees, the racial ethnic identity became more important for the Korean adoptees. But as we see, again, by middle school, 60%, Korean adoptees, they got to deal with this stuff. So it's not like we have the luxury to wait, because, our race is there. And for many children by, elementary school, we're creeping up to half of them having racialized experiences that are bringing their race to the fore. We don't see that as much or as high for the white adoptees. And again, that's because of their race. But I think what was intriguing was I had a conversation with a white adoptee with bright red hair. And she said to me, I always just assumed that maybe I was Irish or, something like that, because I have this red hair. And she had no idea what her ethnicity was. And then she met her biological father and found out that he was actually Mexican American. And so that then totally flipped her identity too. And I think it's intriguing that in research around ethnic identity, we don't ask the questions of white adoptees because they would have very similar questions too, because ultimately our racial and ethnic identities are tied to our biological families. Um, and then what was interesting here that we observed was that there's a slight fall or kind of decrease after young adulthood among the transracial adoptees around their identity. It's still vast majority are working things out in middle adulthood. And again, the late adulthood, we had like only a very small number there. But we were kind of curious about this fall. And one of our hypotheses was that maybe the racial ethnic identity became less important to them because they were able to move into spaces that they felt more comfortable, where they were majority. Many of our respondents had said that they grew up in white communities, white neighborhoods. And again, the research on transracial adoption has found that when transracial adoptees and adoptive parents report living in racially diverse neighborhoods, going to racially diverse schools, their ethnic identity, or positive ethnic and racial identity is enhanced. And so it could be that, or whatever questions here, but again, really curious kind of findings descriptively to kind of unpack more. And then we asked what experiences and services, because of course, I'm always thinking, what can we do? Well, how can we help people even more? We're really helpful for them. And again, we see a little bit of differences between the white and Korean adoptees. But, when you look at here, travel to birth country, attend racially diverse schools, having childcare providers, teachers, adult role models of the same race, family travel to cultural significant places. And this becomes important for white adoptees as well. Read information from the internet or live in a racially diverse neighborhood. These are the top ones, and so what those are experiential experiences. And less important, although it's still important, is reading books, cooking food, but really what seems to matter for the transracial Asian adoptees in this study was being in lived spaces where people look like them. And I think what I often would say when I do presentations to white adoptive parents of transracially adopted children is that I am not Korean one time a year, like, one culture day. I am Korean moment to moment. And so when we begin to understand that our race is not something that is just like one day, woohoo, celebrate, or even, this heritage festival, right? But it is moment to moment, day to day. And that's kind of then how we have to think about giving adoptees the moment to moment, day to day experiences of their ethnic group. I think it would change. And this is not to say that we should go, not have culture camps or culture days. That's not saying that at all. But we need to have that and the day-to-day experiences. And the other really important issue, I think, is who do you invite into the home? Because often what I would when I would say about having more racially diverse neighborhood and spaces, I get these kind of big eyes of like, oh my God, I have to become friends with like every Latino that I see, from the white adoptive parent perspective. And I think that that's not it, right? I'm not friends with every Asian person, but who you have as your friends who come into the home, into your intimate spaces, is communicating something to adopted children about who is in the family and who is not. And when we only bring in white friends, we're communicating something to our Asian child about who my friend networks are. And that has an imprint, right, around who's permissible and who's not, even if we're never explicitly saying it. Let's see. So imagine community, because this was a lot of, my work was community organizing, connecting adoptees, creating a space of empowerment. And so I just want to touch a little bit more about what has expanded over the past 25 years in the Korean adoptee community. So again, what we see is that the adoptees like myself in the 70s and the 80s, we were kind of the peak number. And I am just waiting for the Chinese adoptees, because the big bulk of them are starting to reach late adolescence and in their 20s. And I'm like, oh, we're going to see big things start to happen. So again, that war generation, they were starting to do stuff in the Korean community, adopted community, but it was when we all started to become in our 20s and 30s that groups started to happen. But the early generation was really important. So there was a group that was started in 1994 in Southern California, also known as, and then this group in Washington State were started in 1998, Boston Korean Adoptees. So in 1999, Susan Cox at Holt International, right there, she and another colleague who was a Korean adoptee said, we've been doing these culture camps. What if we did this big gathering of Korean adoptees, of adult adoptees to date, at Washington, D.C.? And so they came up with this idea of the gathering. And this was the first time about 500 Korean adoptees all got together in one space. And again, it was really about decentering authority from adoptive parents and agency people and centering adoptees. So what these 3 days entailed was us being broken up into our years that we had come to the US, and us talking with each other. And there were repertoires, so they wrote it, but it was not facilitated. We were not talked to. We were not told what our experiences were. We sat there and talked with each other. And that was what the conference was. And then, of course, we ate good food. We got pictures at the Capitol. And I think one of the most powerful moments to me was when we placed these flowers at the Korean War Memorial. Because I knew from my research that I would not be in the family that I was in if it hadn't been for the Korean War. That was what changed policy, that allowed so many of us to come to the US. And so that's the start of our history, and the history for all international adoptees and who've come since then. So this was Todd. He was, one of the organizers. He said, we were talking within Holt and how adoptees are being represented, and thought, what if we did a bigger scale, something like a camp, but bigger, and a time period we can get together to talk, just to talk. This became the gathering. And then Mioke Bruning, this quote, she was one of the early activists, and I would say her stance was really about abolishing adoption. But she said, my purpose to start becoming an activist was a self-interest, and that I truly felt I had something to say about being a Korean adoptee, as I was one of the first to speak out on international adoption issues and begin that critique. And again, I think her voice was so vital. It often got shut down. She often got framed as the angry adoptee so that we didn't have to listen to her critique. And we need to be cautious. And then Tim Home, he was one of the founders of the Asian Adult Adoptee of Washington State. He said, sustainability was the biggest challenge. For AAAW, how do you find adoptees when there was no email, no Facebook? And he was also one of the founders of the International Korean Adoptee Association, IKAA, which ended up continuing to organize gatherings after the 1999 gathering all over the world, and most prominently several in Seoul, South Korea. So how do you fund something like that, and how do you make it work? So these are just some of the things that the Korean adoptee community kind of ran with. And these were some of the gatherings all over. I'm just so excited to see what might be possible for especially the Chinese adoptees as they're also coming of age. And then in the Korean adoptee community, several adoptees decided to form organizations within South Korea. So the first one was this Global Overseas Adoptees Link in 1998, Adoptee Solidarity Korea Ask, which is actually is now defunct, and then in 2007, Truth and Reconciliation for Adoption Community. And what these organizations did was really give voice to adoptees in South Korea, and was able to insert adoptees in policies and legislation. In particular, what was significant was Korea was expanding kind of who could be eligible for Korean citizenship. And you had to still be of Korean descent, but they included the specific language of adoptees so that we could go, and if we wanted to reclaim our citizenship, we could, which is really, really powerful. And some adoptees have chosen to do that. This is Kamira Bull. She was the founder of GOAL, which was the very first organization in South Korea. And she said, when I was 11, and she is from the Netherlands, when I was 11, I expressed openly to my adoptive parents that they didn't have the right to displace me from Korea. And I think this is an important feeling because some adoptees feel this way. Their answer was simple: go back to Korea then. I felt it was unfair because I didn't have money of my own to go back. Those feelings were the motive to become independently, emotionally, and financially. So she had some motivations then to go back because her parents basically said, you go figure it out if you didn't feel like this was right, and rather than having a broader conversation. And she's a phenomenal artist as well, using that. Let me just see. Okay, yes, medical information is very, very important. And let me do a couple more and then I'll respond to Katie's question. Amy Nasker ended up taking the leadership of GOAL in South Korea. And so she said, I got a lot of pushback on partnering with agencies and with Koreans. The rule to create an NGO in Korea was that it had to be 100% Korean national representation on the board to be considered a legal entity and to be taken seriously. Adoptees living in Korea were not financially stable. We needed Koreans to fund us. So these are some of the challenges of adoptees who do go back to their birth countries and try to either organize or be recognized as former citizens of those countries. I know a Vietnamese adoptee who ended up going back to Vietnam, and she runs an adoption, an orphanage. So I think there's more stories. And another young adoptee from Russia. His name is Alex. He just recently returned to Russia and is planning some big things there to do around permanency adoption. I know an Indian adoptee who's a social worker, and he returned to India, and in the state in which he had been relinquished, was trying to establish a foster care system there to move children out of institutions. For myself, I ended up in my doctoral program going back to South Korea and doing my dissertation on adolescent mental health and school outcomes of kids in institutional care, because I was really curious as to what happened when kids don't get out. So you can see the different ways some adoptees have taken, their lived experiences and moved it into professional work. And this is just to show some of the artistry and some of the, these are different exhibits that adoptee artists have created. So I really feel that there's these anthologies as well. And again, I'll make this all available so you can see them. And there's newer ones too, and just more stories. So I really feel like back in 1996, I always felt it, or had a sense that I had a culture that was different from people who are not adopted. And I would say to my adoptee friends, it's kind of like we're from another planet, you know? um, and culture is art, books, meeting together, films. And after 25 years, there's such a rich culture of adoptee voices that are transracial and that are Asian. And I just think that this is going to continue to grow. I was really uncomfortable with the idea of a hyphenated identity. These are adoptees, internet sources too, that hyphenated identities are between identities. And I said, well, that's not a very solid place, So I kind of thought of, Asian Americans or Korean Americans. It's like we're on a fence, and a fence is pretty, not solid. And one of the thoughts that I had with Also Known As was that it was the idea that, well, if I gather enough people on this fence, we can collapse the fence and all be on solid ground. And so again, creating that space between spaces of these polarizing things and saying, no, I'm not going to be who you want me to be. I'm going to be me. I'm going to be my truth. I'm going to be, and the truth is I am white and I'm also Korean because I have this racialized body, and I had to learn how to be Asian American. I have to learn how Asian racism works and operates, because I have, I was raised in white privilege, and so I get blinded, but I had to learn it in a way that some of my Asian American friends who are not adopted and raised in Asian families did not. So these were some reflections of some of the adoptees on kind of the changes in the past 20 plus years. And at some level, things haven't changed at all. There's still a level of mistrust. People still don't like certain people, adoption agencies, and that sort of thing. Everyone has a personality. But social media has definitely been a game changer. And then other resources. And one person said, I don't know whether I would have participated. I suppose in adulthood, I became the therapist I would have liked to have seen when I was a child. And that's where it's really quite exciting to see and being able to mentor other adoptees who are wanting to heal themselves and then heal the community. And there's so many ways to do that, either through art, as a therapist, as a writer, professor. Another reflection, on the one hand, I think the community is extremely fractured, and this is the Korean adoptee community. There are parts that are very polarized, but on the other hand, if a person is looking at the right place and has the right mindset, the community is extremely put together. The adoption community looks to me like a very young, vibrant, radical, exciting group of new activists who seem to be very comfortable publicly exploring their adoption identities. And I think in hope for the future, I'm hoping that others will step up and put in the effort to keep things going. kindness toward our own differences, that we are more civil, understanding differences of all sorts and respecting each other's differences, and that we shepherd our community. Korean adoptees are the shepherds of the entire international adoption community. And so I think that's what kind of my main message to the younger generation of Asian adoptees. You don't have to do what Korean adoptees did, and you don't have to do it alone. So you have a community of people who are rooting for you, want to support you. You are welcome always into Korean adoptee spaces. And what I have learned is that Colombian adoptees, Vietnamese adoptees, they need their own spaces too. So in the end, in my study that I'm going to be launching hopefully this summer, is not only looking at adult outcomes, but adoptees who participate in such groups and those who don't, and trying to understand why community is important and bring some data around that. But to me, in the end, community is important because it's a place for us to belong. It's a place for us to explore. It's a place for us to build knowledge from each other. It's a place where we can feel power and empowered, and is a place where we can evoke change. So that's me. Oh, that's my Gmail. But anyway. Okay, I'm gonna stop so I can see you all, and we can just have a conversation for 8 minutes. Okay.
I would very much like to access to the recording and to your slides, because I've got 3 young adults that are just embarking on this whole, who am I really? And I shared the link, but I don't think any of them saw it when I sent it away. Is that possible?
I think so. I don't know, Mijin, where is the recording going to go?
I think I can give it to the UMSA, and it will be saved in the UMSA's cloud. So if you want, please send me email. I will shoot the link for the video clip.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so Katie asked the question in the chat, would you encourage or discourage American parents exploring international adoption? Katie, do you want to expand on that question at all, or is she there?
Yeah, hey, so I'm somebody who is an interest in adoption as far as growing my family. So that's something that I'm interested in exploring. I also recognize that my partner and I are both white, so we want to do this in an intentional way that is going to be best for the child and not just for us. So I'm just curious to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so you already sound great. If you want my approval. So this is it. And especially with my dissertation and looking at kids in institutional facilities, of which the ones that I visited were high functioning. So they were all kind of the SOS model, where children lived in small cottages of 7 to 8 kids. I think the max number was maybe 60 kids per institution. And, so you had like a family pod and an adult. But the problem is that the adult is still a job. And so they would have multiple adults, in that pod of 7 or 8 people. And what I really got to see is this is not an either or thing. We have a problem. We have a problem of unintended pregnancies. We have problems of parents not wanting to parent, and we have problems of child abandonment. This is the reality. What can we do to help? And while I really appreciate the critique of international adoption, because I do think we have not built a system that respects and honors people's right to information, to know who they are. We have built a systems of secrecy and disconnection rather than systems of connection and expansion. So that's what I want to dismantle. I don't want to dismantle international adoption as an option for children or for a prospective adoptive parents. I want to change the culture around secrecy and disconnection. So what I like to say is adoption means more. Adoption means more complexity. It means more family, not less, because really who you are adopting is not only that child, but that child's biological family, extended family, culture, society, right? So if you are willing to step into that more and expand yourself, I think you would be a phenomenal potential adoptive parent. But it is when adoptive parents are going in, not for the more, but for the me. I want this for me. I want this because I want to look like a good person. Or some sort of otherness that's really about their need to feel good. That's where problems can happen. Because the fact is that who you are adopting as a child is much more than who that child will be in your life. They bring in all of their past, even if they come into your family at the age of 2 months. We know, that children before they're born, have very active experiences in the womb where they're tasting the food that their mother ate, they're hearing the sounds. And so a baby who comes to you at 1 month or 2 months still has had 9 months of a lived experience somewhere else. I think what's intriguing is that most of the work and research on adoption started in the 1960s with white infant placed adoptees who were suddenly showing up in high or the normal frequencies with therapists and with problems. And there was a moment, thank God, it's past, where they thought there was an adoptee syndrome, like a disorder, when very wise developmental psychologists said, no, they are responding normatively to something that happened to them, which is the separation, lack of information, and disconnection. And when you have those experiences, then it seems very rightful that you would feel sad, depressed, lost, confused, and wanting and desiring then that information. So I think we can't pathologize adoption. We have to see all the circumstances, and that the way that we have historically practiced adoption has not honored all of our connections as adoptees.
I just want to reach out to Katie and say that we adopted our son in 2003 from Cali, Colombia, and I'd be happy to talk to you about our experience. And we're in the throes of the teenage years and the identity issues. Right now, it's not easy, but I'm thrilled to be a parent.
Mm-hmm. Hyun?
Holly. I wanted to say that having gone through, I'm 58 years old, I'm turning 59 next month. And having had such a problematic adoption that was transracial, but it was private. And so in that respect, I say it was human trafficking, because I was adopted by my maternal aunt and her husband, who was a pedophile. And so there are those issues, but the bigger issue that I see, just having been in the Korean adoptive space for the past 5 years, is that there is this attachment disorder that really needs to get really addressed in a way that is still not being truly addressed. So anyone that is going through adoption or has that wish to do that, I say, please really study attachment disorder, and then know that there is the biological part of, we as children have maternal stem cells, and the mothers also have the stem cells of their children. So there is this biological link that we know that cells can communicate no matter how long the distance. So that's why mother's intuition happens, is from the, I believe that these are the stem cells that allow mother's intuition. But children also have that, where it's like a two-way radio. So we know when our mothers are distressed, as well as our mothers know when we are distressed. And so if you can take all that into account as well and truly address that, I think that you'll have a much, much better outcome.
And I think at the end, thank you for that, Hyun. I think those are really good points. And, I think often I get asked, like, well, what can I do, as an adoptive parent or a spouse of an adoptive parent? And I think the biggest thing that you can do is your own work, is healing where you have not felt connected and attached and loving. Because or where you were modeled in your own family. Because attachment is a two-way street. You as a parent have to attach to the child, and the child has to attach to you. Now, in many ways, children for survival will attach. They have no choice. And so they are biologically programmed to connect, but that still doesn't mean it's a healthy attachment, right? So it can be attachment that's really born out of fear and a loss. And so this is where we say it's a disordered attachment or that sort of thing in young children. What we don't have good research on in attachment theory is how do these childhood attachments look in adulthood and in your adult relationships or in adolescence, right? And so this is also where it's further complicated for adoptees, because on the one hand, at these critical moments of development, we are supposed to not attach to our families, right? That's developmental, but we're already not connected to our families. So because we don't have the security of biology, of blood, even narratively, culturally, and physiologically, right? So for an adoptee, it's like, how do I disconnect from the only family that I know that I'm petrified anyway that I might lose, because then who would I be and where would I live, right? So why does adolescent then moving forward, become maybe more wrought, and maybe they're acting out more because they're really testing to see, are you going to show up for me again? Because I'm already know that I'm not biologically connected to you. And so what is actually holding us together? And so then that fear comes up and you get tested and pushed and pushed and pushed. Often I've seen adoptive parents to the point of almost like giving up. And I always say, please don't hang in there. Just keep showing up for them, please. Because that's the very thing that they are waiting to happen because of our very early experiences for some of us of disconnection, and then not having other ways to connect. And I want to add that the research on cultural socialization is phenomenal. It shows that white parents, if they are, engaged, enter into spaces that look like their children and not them, kids develop healthy racial ethnic identities. So, and what we found is that kids report feeling closer to their parents when they do engage in cultural activities. So you're actually reinforcing and strengthening your attachment when you participate with your child in all of who they are. And they're obviously participating in everything that you are. So, I feel like if I can be Irish Catholic, my parents can be Korean American. And know that you are not walking in that body. So it's not the same. So it's 12:04. I don't know if there's any other one final question, comment, but I want to respect your time, and I really am thrilled that you came to listen. And if you want to talk more about this, I would be happy to. This is my work.
It's been very, very wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I'm going to stop. Oh, okay. I'm going to stop.